In the heart of Windsor Castle, where centuries of royal protocol have been carved into stone and tradition, one moment of disrespect would trigger a chain of events that no one saw coming. What started as a simple exchange between Queen Camilla and a dedicated royal guard would soon expose hidden truths about power, loyalty, and the price of crossing lines that should never be crossed. The guard had served the royal family for over 15 years without a single complaint on his record. He had stood motionless through state dinners, protected visiting dignitaries, and maintained the highest standards of royal service. But, on that crisp autumn morning in October 2024, everything he believed about duty and respect would be tested in ways he never imagined. What Queen Camilla said to him in those few seconds would not only shock him to his core but would also set in motion a series of revelations that would shake the very foundations of the modern British monarchy. This is the true story of what happened when protocol met pride, when respect collided with reality, and when one guard's decision to stand up for himself changed the course of royal history forever. The morning of October 15, 2024, started like any other day at Windsor Castle for James Morrison, a royal protection officer who had dedicated the better part of his adult life to serving the British royal family. At 38 years old, James had built his entire career around the principles of duty, honor, and unwavering loyalty to the crown. His record was spotless, his dedication unquestionable, and his respect for the institution absolute. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the ancient windows of the castle, James began his routine morning preparations. He had been assigned to the East Wing security detail, a position that required him to monitor the private corridors where senior royals often moved between their personal quarters and official staterooms. It was a role that demanded both vigilance and discretion, qualities that James had mastered over his 15 years of service. The castle was unusually quiet that morning. King Charles was away on an official visit to Scotland, and most of the senior staff were either accompanying him or enjoying a rare moment of reduced activity. Queen Camilla had remained at Windsor to handle some personal matters and catch up on correspondence that had been piling up during the busy autumn schedule of royal engagements. James positioned himself at his designated post near the corridor that connected the Queen's private study to the main reception areas. He stood with the perfect posture that had become second nature to him, his eyes scanning the hallway with the trained awareness of a professional who understood that even in the safest of environments, vigilance was never optional. His dark blue uniform was immaculate, every button polished, every crease sharp. He embodied the very essence of what royal security should represent. Around 9:30 in the morning, James heard the familiar sound of heels clicking against the marble floor. Queen Camilla was approaching from the direction of her private quarters, likely heading to her study for the morning's work. James straightened even further, if such a thing were possible, preparing to offer the respectful acknowledgement that protocol demanded whenever a senior royal passed his position. Queen Camilla appeared around the corner, dressed in an elegant cream-colored coat dress that spoke of both sophistication and understated royal style. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had grown into her role as queen consort with remarkable grace. However, on this particular morning, there was something different about her demeanor. James, with his years of experience reading the subtle moods and temperaments of the royalty protected, noticed immediately that she seemed somewhat distracted, perhaps even slightly irritated. As she approached his position, James executed the standard respectful nod that was appropriate for his rank and role. It was neither too formal nor too casual, perfectly calibrated to show respect while maintaining the professional distance that was essential in his position. He had performed this same gesture thousands of times before with every member of the royal family, and it had never been anything other than well received or, at minimum, politely acknowledged. But, on this morning, something went terribly wrong. Queen Camilla stopped directly in front of James, her eyes fixing on him with an intensity that immediately put him on alert. For a moment, the hallway was completely silent except for the distant sounds of castle staff going about their morning duties in other parts of the building. James maintained his position, waiting for whatever the Queen might need from him. What came next would haunt James for months to come and would mark the beginning of a chain of events that nobody in the royal household could have anticipated. "Excuse me," Queen Camilla said, her voice carrying a tone that James had never heard directed at him before. It was sharp, dismissive, and filled with an unmistakable edge of annoyance. "Do you think your little nod is somehow impressive? Do you imagine that your acknowledgement means something to me?" James felt his heart skip a beat. In all his years of service, he had never been addressed by any member of the royal family in such a manner. The words hit him like a physical blow, not because they were shouted or dramatic, but because they were delivered with such casual cruelty. The Queen's tone suggested that she viewed his respectful gesture not as the professional courtesy it was intended to be, but as some sort of presumptuous overreach. "Your Majesty," James began carefully, his training kicking in despite his shock. "I apologize if my greeting was inappropriate in any way. I was simply following standard protocol for acknowledging your presence." Queen Camilla's expression shifted to one of barely contained disdain. "Standard protocol," she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "Let me make something very clear to you. You are here to be invisible, to blend into the background like a piece of furniture. You are not here to insert yourself into my morning with your nodding and acknowledging. I don't need your recognition, and I certainly don't want it." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. James felt his face flush with a mixture of embarrassment and growing anger. He had dedicated his life to protecting the very people who were now treating him as less than human. Every birthday missed with his children, every holiday spent on duty, every personal sacrifice made in service to the crown suddenly felt meaningless in the face of such casual disregard for his dignity. Furthermore, Queen Camilla continued, seemingly oblivious to the impact her words were having, "I expect you to remember your place. You are not a person I interact with. You are not someone whose presence I acknowledge. You are simply part of the security apparatus, nothing more. Is that understood?" James stood there for a moment that felt like an eternity. His mind raced through 15 years of loyal service, thinking of all the times he had put his life on the line for the royal family, all the moments when he had been thanked for his dedication, all the assurances he had received that his service was valued and appreciated. In this single encounter, all of that seemed to crumble away. The professional in him knew he should simply say "Yes, Your Majesty," and let the matter drop. That would be the safe response, the one that would maintain his position and avoid any further confrontation. But something deeper in James, something that connected to his sense of basic human dignity, would not allow him to simply accept such treatment without response. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging within him, "with all due respect, I have served this family for 15 years. I have never been anything but professional and appropriate in my conduct. I understand the importance of protocol and boundaries, but I also believe that basic human respect should be part of any interaction, regardless of rank or position." The silence that followed was deafening. Queen Camilla's eyes widened slightly, and, for a moment, James wondered if she was shocked that he had dared to respond at all, let alone with such directness. The hallway seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls of Windsor Castle were waiting to see how this unprecedented moment would resolve itself. Queen Camilla's face went through several subtle changes of expression before settling into a cold mask of authority. "How dare you," she said slowly, her voice low but filled with unmistakable menace. "How dare you speak to me about respect when you clearly don't understand the first thing about it? Respect means knowing your place, and your place is not to lecture me about human dignity or to challenge my words in any way." She took a step closer to James, and he could see the genuine anger building in her eyes. "You will learn, officer, that there are consequences for forgetting who you are and who I am. This conversation is not over, and neither is your lesson in appropriate behavior." With that, Queen Camilla turned sharply and continued down the hallway toward her study, leaving James standing alone in the corridor with his mind reeling from what had just occurred. The click of her heels against the marble floor gradually faded into the distance, but the impact of her words continued to echo in his head. James remained at his post for the rest of his shift, but his mind was far from focused on security protocols. Instead, he found himself replaying the encounter over and over, analyzing every word, every tone, every implication of what had transpired. He had always known that there were vast differences in rank and status within the royal household, but he had never before experienced such a complete dismissal of his basic humanity. As the day progressed, James began to notice subtle changes in how other staff members interacted with him. Word traveled quickly in the close-knit environment of Windsor Castle, and it seemed that news of his confrontation with Queen Camilla had already begun to spread. Some colleagues avoided eye contact, others offered sympathetic looks when they thought no one was watching. The message was clear: he had crossed a line that should never be crossed, and there would be consequences. That evening, as James drove home to his small flat in Windsor Town, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had fundamentally changed in those few minutes of conversation. He had always prided himself on his professionalism, his ability to serve with dignity and honor. Now, for the first time in his career, he questioned whether those values were truly appreciated or if they were simply convenient illusions that could be shattered by anyone with enough power and authority. His wife, Sarah, noticed immediately that something was wrong when he walked through the door. After 20 years of marriage, she knew her husband's moods better than anyone, and she could see the tension written across his face and in the set of his shoulders. Their 2 children, Emma and David, were in the living room doing homework, but Sarah let James into the kitchen where they could speak privately. "What happened today?" she asked directly. Sarah had learned long ago that James was not one to volunteer information about difficult situations, but she also knew that he needed to talk about whatever was troubling him. James sat down heavily at the kitchen table and began to tell his wife about the morning's encounter. As he recounted Queen Camilla's words and his own response, he watched Sarah's expression change from concern to shock to anger. By the time he finished, she was sitting in stunned silence. "She actually said that to you?" Sarah asked finally. "After everything you've done for that family, after all the years you've given them, she treated you like you were nothing?" James nodded, feeling a fresh wave of anger as he heard the story again through his wife's ears. "The worst part is that I don't know what I did wrong. I was following the same protocol I've followed for 15 years. A simple, respectful acknowledgement. Nothing more, nothing less." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "You didn't do anything wrong, James." "What she did was wrong. Completely wrong. No one deserves to be spoken to that way, regardless of their job or position." As they sat together in their kitchen, James felt both the comfort of his wife's support and the growing weight of an impossible situation. He loved his job, believed in the institution he served, and had built his entire career around royal service. But now, for the first time, he was forced to confront the possibility that his loyalty and dedication might not be valued as highly as he had always believed. The seeds of change had been planted in those few minutes of conversation in the Windsor Castle hallway. James Morrison had no way of knowing that his decision to speak up for his own dignity would eventually lead to revelations that would shake the very foundations of the modern monarchy. All he knew was that something fundamental had shifted, and there would be no going back to the way things were before. That night, as he lay awake staring at the ceiling, James made a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. He would not simply accept what had happened and move on. He would not pretend that Queen Camilla's treatment of him was acceptable simply because of her position. For the first time in his career, James Morrison was going to stand up for himself, regardless of the consequences. The morning of October 15, 2024, had indeed changed everything. The question now was what would happen next, and whether one royal protection officer's decision to maintain his dignity would be worth the price he was almost certainly going to have to pay. The next morning brought with it a sense of foreboding that James Morrison couldn't shake. As he drove through the gates of Windsor Castle for what would prove to be one of the most challenging days of his career, he noticed that the usual friendly waves from the gate security seemed more formal, more distant. Word had definitely spread about his encounter with Queen Camilla, and the royal household's efficient gossip network had already begun to work against him. James parked in his usual spot and made his way to the security briefing room where the day's assignments were distributed. The room, which normally buzzed with quiet conversation and the occasional joke between colleagues, fell noticeably silent when he entered. His fellow officers looked up briefly before returning their attention to their paperwork and equipment checks with an intensity that seemed forced and uncomfortable. Sergeant Michael Harrison, who had been James's immediate supervisor for the past 5 years, approached him with an expression that mixed sympathy with professional concern. Michael was a career military man who had transitioned to royal protection after 20 years in the army, and he had always been someone James respected and trusted. "James," Michael said quietly, guiding him to a corner of the room where they could speak without being overheard. "We need to talk. There's been a development regarding yesterday's incident." The formal tone in Michael's voice immediately put James on alert. In all their years of working together, Michael had always been straightforward and supportive, treating his team with the respect and camaraderie that came from shared experience and mutual trust. This morning, however, there was something different in his demeanor, something that suggested he was operating under constraints that were beyond his control. "What kind of development?" James asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Michael glanced around the room to ensure they weren't being watched too closely, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I received a call last night from Commander Phillips. He's been instructed to conduct a formal review of your conduct and your continued suitability for royal protection duties." Commander Phillips was the head of royal security, a position that placed him directly under the authority of the royal household's senior management. James had met him only a handful of times, but he knew that Phillips was someone who took his responsibilities seriously and was not given to making hasty decisions. If Phillips was conducting a formal review, it meant that the complaint had gone all the way to the top of the security hierarchy. "A formal review?" James repeated, feeling his heart sink. "Michael, you know my record. 15 years without a single complaint, commendations for service, perfect attendance, and complete dedication to the job. What grounds could there possibly be for questioning my suitability?" Michael's expression grew even more grave. "According to the report that was filed, you were insubordinate and disrespectful to Her Majesty Queen Camilla. The complaint alleges that you challenged her authority, spoke to her in an inappropriate manner, and demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of your role and responsibilities." James felt his face flush with anger and disbelief. The description bore no resemblance to what had actually occurred the previous morning. He had been respectful throughout the entire encounter, even when faced with treatment that no human being should have to endure. To have his attempt to maintain his dignity characterized as insubordination was not only unfair, it was a complete distortion of the truth. "That's not what happened, Michael," James said firmly. "I was completely professional. I followed protocol exactly as I have for 15 years. The Queen was the one who was inappropriate, not me." Michael held up a hand to stop him from continuing. "James, I believe you. I've worked with you long enough to know your character and your professionalism. But right now, it's not about what I believe or what actually happened. It's about the fact that a senior member of the royal family has filed a formal complaint, and that means the matter has to be taken seriously regardless of the circumstances." The reality of the situation began to settle on James like a heavy weight. In the hierarchical world of the royal household, the word of a senior royal was not questioned, it was accepted as fact. His version of events, no matter how truthful, would always be seen as less credible than Queen Camilla's account. The system was designed to protect the monarchy, not the individuals who served it. "What does this review involve?" James asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the growing panic he felt inside. "You're being temporarily reassigned to administrative duties pending the completion of the investigation," Michael explained. "No more direct royal protection, no access to secure areas, and no interaction with any member of the royal family. Commander Phillips wants to see you in his office at 10 this morning." The implications of this temporary reassignment hit James immediately. In the world of royal protection, being pulled from active duty was tantamount to being declared unsuitable for service. Even if he was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing, the mere fact that he had been under investigation would follow him for the rest of his career. Other officers would always wonder what he had done to warrant such scrutiny, and senior management would always see him as someone who had caused problems, regardless of whether those problems were justified. As James made his way to Commander Phillips's office, he passed through corridors that had become as familiar to him as his own home over the past 15 years. Every portrait, every piece of furniture, every architectural detail held memories of his service to the crown. He thought about all the times he had stood guard during state dinners, protecting visiting heads of state and ensuring the safety of the royal family during some of the most important moments in recent British history. He remembered the wedding of Prince William and Catherine, where he had been part of the security detail that ensured the event proceeded without incident. He thought about the Diamond Jubilee celebrations, where his vigilance and professionalism had contributed to one of the most successful royal events in decades. All of those memories now seemed tainted by the knowledge that his years of loyal service could be wiped away by a single moment of standing up for his own dignity. Commander Phillips's office was located in one of the more modern sections of the castle, where the demands of contemporary security operations had necessitated the installation of advanced communication equipment and surveillance technology. Phillips himself was a man in his early 50s who had risen through the ranks of royal protection through a combination of exceptional competence and absolute discretion. He was known for being fair but firm, and for making decisions based on what was best for the security of the royal family rather than on personal considerations. When James knocked on the door, he was immediately invited to enter. Commander Phillips was sitting behind his desk, which was covered with files and reports that James assumed related to his case. Phillips looked up as he entered, and James could see in his expression the weight of a difficult situation that no one really wanted to deal with. "Officer Morrison," Phillips said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "Please, sit down." James took the offered seat and waited for Phillips to begin what he knew would be a conversation that could determine the future of his career. The office was silent except for the distant sounds of castle activity filtering through the heavy windows. "I'm going to be direct with you, Morrison," Phillips began. "I've received a formal complaint from Her Majesty Queen Camilla regarding your conduct yesterday morning. According to the report, you were disrespectful, argumentative, and failed to show proper deference to her position. These are serious allegations that I'm required to investigate thoroughly." James took a deep breath before responding. He knew that this conversation would be crucial in determining how the investigation proceeded, and he needed to be both honest and strategic in his response. "Sir," James said carefully, "I understand that you have to take any complaint from a senior royal seriously, and I respect that. However, I need you to know that the characterization of my behavior in that complaint does not accurately reflect what actually occurred." Phillips leaned back in his chair and studied James's face. "Tell me what happened, in your own words." James recounted the entire encounter, being careful to stick to the facts and avoid letting his emotions color his description of events. He explained his standard protocol acknowledgement, Queen Camilla's unexpected and harsh response, and his attempt to respectfully defend his professionalism. Throughout his account, Phillips listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes on a legal pad. When James finished his story, Phillips was quiet for several moments, apparently considering what he had heard. Finally, he spoke. "Morrison, I've read your file. 15 years of exemplary service, multiple commendations, no disciplinary actions, and consistent positive evaluations from supervisors. Your record speaks to your character and professionalism." James felt a small spark of hope at these words, but Phillips's expression remained serious. However, Phillips continued, "I'm also dealing with a complaint from someone whose word carries enormous weight in this institution. Regardless of what actually happened yesterday morning, the fact remains that there has been a breakdown in the relationship between you and a senior member of the royal family. That creates a situation that I have to address." The hope that James had begun to feel quickly evaporated. He realized that Phillips was not really concerned with determining who was right or wrong in the encounter. The commander's primary responsibility was maintaining the smooth operation of royal security, and James's continued presence had become a potential source of friction and complications. "What are my options, sir?" James asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Phillips shuffled through some papers on his desk before responding. "I'm recommending that you be transferred to a different position within the Royal Protection Service, one that doesn't involve direct contact with senior royals. There's an opening in perimeter security that would maintain your current rank and salary while removing you from any situations where similar conflicts might arise." James felt his heart sink. Perimeter security was essentially a dead-end position, the place where officers were sent when they were no longer considered suitable for the more prestigious and challenging roles within royal protection. It was a professional exile that would effectively end any prospects for advancement and would mark him as someone who had fallen out of favor with the royal hierarchy. "And if I don't accept that transfer?" James asked. "Then, I would be forced to recommend your dismissal from Royal Protection Service entirely," Phillips replied. "The complaint against you is serious enough that it provides grounds for termination, especially if you're seen as being uncooperative with attempts to resolve the situation. the choice Phillips was offering wasn't really a choice at all. James could accept professional exile or face complete dismissal from a career he had devoted his life to building. Neither option addressed the fundamental injustice of what had occurred, and both would effectively punish him for refusing to accept treatment that violated his basic human dignity. "I need time to think about this," James said. "Of course," Phillips replied. "Take the rest of the day. But I'll need your decision by tomorrow morning. In the meantime, you're assigned to administrative duties in the main office. Report to Sergeant Williams, and he'll give you your assignments." As James left Phillips's office, he felt a mixture of anger, disappointment, and determination that he had never experienced before. The institution he had served with such dedication was now demanding that he choose between his principles and his career. The royal family, which had always represented values of duty, honor, and service in his mind, was now asking him to sacrifice his dignity in order to protect someone who had treated him with casual cruelty. Walking through the castle corridors toward the administrative offices, James passed several colleagues who offered sympathetic looks but kept their distance. Word of his situation had clearly spread throughout the security detail, and everyone understood that associating with him could potentially damage their own standing within the organization. The administrative office was a stark contrast to the prestigious and dynamic environment of active royal protection. Instead of monitoring security feeds from important events or coordinating with other agencies to ensure royal safety, James found himself assigned to filing reports and updating database entries. It was mind-numbing work that felt designed to emphasize just how far he had fallen from his previous position. As he sat at a desk dealing with paperwork that seemed designed to waste time rather than serve any meaningful purpose, James began to think about the broader implications of his situation. His case was not just about one encounter with Queen Camilla, it was about the fundamental power dynamics within the monarchy and whether people who served the crown had any rights to basic human dignity. That evening, James drove home with a heavy heart and a head full of conflicting thoughts. He knew that Sarah would want to hear everything about his meeting with Commander Phillips, and he dreaded having to tell her that her husband's career was essentially over because he had refused to accept being treated like a piece of furniture. When he walked through the door of their modest home, Sarah took one look at his face and knew that the day had brought nothing but bad news. Their children were upstairs doing homework, so they sat down in the living room where James could tell her about the impossible choice he had been given. "They want you to accept exile or lose your job entirely?" Sarah asked, her voice rising with indignation. "After 15 years of perfect service, they're punishing you for refusing to be humiliated?" "That's essentially what it comes down to," James replied. "Phillips made it clear that my version of events doesn't really matter. What matters is that Queen Camilla has complained, and the easiest way to resolve the situation is to make me disappear from her sight." Sarah was quiet for several minutes, clearly processing the injustice of the situation and thinking about what it would mean for their family's future. Finally, she looked at her husband with an expression of fierce determination. "James," she said, "I know how much your job means to you, and I know how much you believe in serving the crown. But I also know the man I married, and he's not someone who backs down from doing what's right just because it's difficult or dangerous." James looked at his wife, seeing in her eyes the same strength and conviction that had attracted him to her 20 years earlier. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe it's time to stop thinking about this as your problem to solve quietly and start thinking about it as a problem that other people should know about. You're not the first royal employee who has been treated badly, and you won't be the last. But maybe you could be the first one who decides to do something about it." As Sarah's words sank in, James began to consider possibilities that he had never allowed himself to think about before. What if he didn't have to choose between his principles and his career? What if there was a third option that involved fighting back against a system that demanded he sacrifice his dignity for the convenience of people who had forgotten that their privileges came with responsibilities? For the first time since his encounter with Queen Camilla, James Morrison began to think about what it might mean to refuse both of the options that Commander Phillips had offered him. The seeds of rebellion that had been planted in the Windsor Castle hallway were beginning to grow into something much larger and more dangerous to the established order. The consequences of standing up to Queen Camilla were becoming clearer with each passing hour, but so were the possibilities for changing a system that had operated without challenge for far too long. James Morrison was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can do is decide that they have had enough of accepting the unacceptable. James Morrison spent the night after his meeting with Commander Phillips staring at the ceiling of his bedroom, wrestling with a decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his life. By morning, he had made up his mind. He would not accept either of the options that had been presented to him. Instead, he would do something that no Royal Protection Officer in recent memory had ever attempted. He would fight back against the system that was trying to silence him. The first step in his plan involved reaching out to someone he had never expected to need, a lawyer. James had always prided himself on being able to handle his problems through proper channels and official procedures. The idea of involving outside legal counsel in what was essentially a workplace dispute felt foreign and uncomfortable to him. However, the events of the past few days had made it clear that the proper channels were designed to protect the monarchy, not the individuals who served it. James contacted Margaret Whitfield, a solicitor who specialized in employment law and had a reputation for taking on cases that other lawyers might consider too challenging or controversial. Margaret's office was located in a converted Georgian townhouse in Windsor, close enough to the castle that she had developed considerable expertise in dealing with employment issues related to the royal household. When James called Margaret's office and explained that he needed to discuss an employment matter involving his position as a Royal Protection Officer, the receptionist immediately scheduled an emergency consultation for that afternoon. It was clear that Margaret's practice was accustomed to dealing with urgent situations that couldn't wait for standard appointment scheduling. Margaret Whitfield turned out to be a woman in her early 40s with the kind of sharp intelligence and direct manner that came from years of battling institutional power on behalf of individual clients. Her office was lined with law books and case files, and the walls were covered with framed certificates and awards that testified to her expertise and success in employment law. When James finished recounting his story, Margaret leaned back in her chair and studied him with the kind of intense focus that made it clear she was already analyzing the legal implications of his situation. "Mr. Morrison," she said finally, "what you're describing is a textbook case of workplace harassment and constructive dismissal. The fact that it involves a member of the royal family doesn't change the fundamental legal principles at stake here." James felt a surge of relief at hearing his experience validated by someone with the expertise to understand its legal significance. For days, he had been made to feel as though he was the problem, as though his refusal to accept Queen Camilla's treatment was somehow unreasonable or inappropriate. However, Margaret continued, "You need to understand that pursuing this case will be unlike anything I've ever handled, and probably unlike anything any employment lawyer in this country has ever handled. We would be taking on one of the most powerful and well-protected institutions in British society." The gravity of what he was considering began to sink in for James. This wasn't just about his job or even his career. This was about challenging the fundamental assumption that members of the royal family were above the normal standards of human decency and workplace conduct that applied to everyone else. "What would be involved in pursuing this?" James asked. Margaret pulled out a legal pad and began outlining the process that would be required. "First, we would need to file a formal complaint with the employment tribunal, alleging harassment and constructive dismissal. We would need to document everything that happened, gather any potential witnesses, and prepare for the possibility that this case could drag on for months or even years." She paused and looked directly at James. "You also need to understand that win or lose, your life will never be the same. The royal household has resources and influence that most people can't even imagine. They will use every tool at their disposal to discredit you, to make your life difficult, and to ensure that other employees think twice before following your example." James listened to Margaret's warnings with a mixture of fear and determination. Everything she was saying confirmed his worst suspicions about what he would be facing. At the same time, her words also reinforced his conviction that someone needed to stand up to a system that had operated without accountability for far too long. "There's something else you should consider," Margaret said. "This case would inevitably attract significant media attention. The idea of a royal protection officer taking a member of the royal family to court would be front-page news in every paper in the country. Your privacy, your family's privacy, everything about your life would become public property." The mention of his family brought James back to one of his biggest concerns about pursuing legal action. Sarah had been supportive of his decision to stand up for himself, but He wondered how she would feel about having their entire lives dissected in the tabloid press. Their children would have to deal with the scrutiny and potential harassment that came from being associated with someone who was challenging the monarchy. "I need to discuss this with my family before I make a final decision," James said. "Of course," Margaret replied. "But I want you to think about something while you're considering your options. This isn't just about you and what happened to you. The royal household employs hundreds of people, from protection officers to housekeeping staff to administrative personnel. If they're willing to treat someone with your experience and record this badly, imagine what they're doing to people who have less job security and fewer protections." Margaret's words hit James like a revelation. He had been so focused on his own situation that he hadn't fully considered the broader implications of what he had experienced. His case could potentially help other royal employees who were facing similar treatment but didn't have the resources or the courage to fight back on their own. That evening, James sat down with Sarah and their children for what he knew would be one of the most important family conversations of their lives. Emma and David, at 16 and 14 respectively, were old enough to understand the seriousness of the situation and the potential consequences of their father's decision. James explained everything that had happened, from his encounter with Queen Camilla to his meeting with Margaret Whitfield. He was honest about the risks they would all face if he decided to pursue legal action, and he made it clear that this was a decision that would affect the entire family, not just him. "Dad," Emma said when he had finished his explanation, "I've always been proud of the work you do and the way you've served the royal family. But I'm even more proud of you for standing up for yourself and for what's right." David nodded in agreement. "It's not fair what they're trying to do to you. You've given them everything, and they're treating you like garbage just because you wouldn't let someone be mean to you." Sarah reached across the table and took James's hand. "Whatever you decide, we'll support you. But I want you to know that I think Margaret is right about this being bigger than just your situation. Maybe it's time someone showed that even the royal family has to follow the same rules as everyone else when it comes to treating their employees with basic human respect." The support of his family gave James the final piece of courage he needed to make his decision. The next morning, he called Margaret Whitfield and told her that he wanted to proceed with filing a formal complaint against Queen Camilla and the royal household. The process of preparing the legal case proved to be both exhausting and enlightening for James. Margaret and her team interviewed him for hours, going over every detail of his encounter with Queen Camilla and documenting his entire employment history with the Royal Protection Service. They requested copies of his personnel file, his performance evaluations, and any other documentation that could support his case. What emerged from this process was a picture of an exemplary employee who had been subjected to treatment that would be considered unacceptable in any other workplace. James's record was so spotless and his reputation so solid that it became increasingly difficult to argue that Queen Camilla's complaint had any basis in his actual performance or behavior. Margaret also began reaching out to other current and former royal household employees, trying to determine whether James's experience was an isolated incident or part of a broader pattern of inappropriate behavior. What she discovered was both disturbing and encouraging for their case. Several former employees came forward with stories of their own encounters with senior royals that involved similar displays of casual cruelty and disrespect. A former housekeeping supervisor described being berated by a senior royal for 30 minutes over a minor scheduling issue, with language that was both personally insulting and completely disproportionate to the supposed problem. A former chauffeur told of being ordered to work 16-hour days during a royal tour without overtime pay or adequate rest breaks, and then being criticized for showing signs of fatigue. When he attempted to raise concerns about the safety implications of exhausted drivers, he was told that his job was to do as he was told, not to think about consequences. These stories painted a picture of a workplace culture where senior royals felt entitled to treat their employees as personal property rather than as human beings deserving of basic respect and fair treatment. The pattern that emerged suggested that James's encounter with Queen Camilla was not an aberration, but rather a typical example of how power was exercised within the royal household. However, getting these former employees to agree to testify or provide formal statements proved to be much more challenging than simply getting them to share their stories privately. The royal household's standard employment contracts included strict confidentiality clauses that could result in significant financial penalties for anyone who spoke publicly about their experiences. Additionally, many former employees had moved on to other positions where association with a legal case against the royal family could damage their career prospects. Margaret worked with her contacts in the legal community to develop strategies for protecting potential witnesses and challenging the enforceability of confidentiality agreements that might be used to prevent legitimate testimony about workplace harassment. It became clear that the legal battle would involve not just the specific incident between James and Queen Camilla, but also broader questions about the extent to which the royal household could use its power and influence to silence employees who experienced mistreatment. As word of James's legal case began to spread through unofficial channels, the royal household's response was swift and predictable. Commander Phillips called James into his office and informed him that his temporary assignment to administrative duties was being extended indefinitely pending the resolution of his legal situation. "Morrison," Phillips said, his tone more formal and distant than it had been in their previous meeting, "I'm disappointed that you've chosen to pursue this matter through external channels rather than working with us to find an internal solution." James looked at his former supervisor with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Sir, with all due respect, the internal solution you offered me was to accept professional exile or lose my job entirely. That's not really a solution, that's just a way of making the problem disappear without addressing the fundamental issue." Phillips's expression hardened. "The fundamental issue, Morrison, is that you've forgotten your place in this organization. Royal protection is not a democracy where employees get to challenge the decisions and behavior of the people we're sworn to protect. It's a hierarchical system that depends on absolute loyalty and unquestioning obedience." The conversation with Phillips confirmed for James that he had made the right decision in pursuing legal action. The royal household was not interested in addressing the legitimate concerns he had raised about workplace harassment and basic human dignity. They were only interested in maintaining a system that allowed senior royals to exercise unlimited power over their employees without any accountability or oversight. Meanwhile, Margaret and her team continued their preparation for what they knew would be an unprecedented legal battle. The case was generating interest not just in the UK, but internationally, as media outlets began to pick up on the story of a royal protection officer who was taking on the British monarchy in court. The royal household's legal team, representing both Queen Camilla personally and the institution as a whole, filed preliminary motions arguing that the case should be dismissed on grounds of royal immunity and constitutional principle. They claimed that allowing employees to sue members of the royal family would undermine the monarchy's ability to function effectively and would set a dangerous precedent that could lead to frivolous lawsuits from disgruntled employees. Margaret and her team responded with legal briefs arguing that royal immunity had never been intended to protect members of the royal family from the consequences of workplace harassment, and that basic employment law protections should apply to royal household employees just as they did to workers in any other organization. The preliminary legal skirmishing made it clear that this case would involve fundamental questions about the extent of royal privilege in modern British society. It was no longer just about whether Queen Camilla had treated James Morrison inappropriately, it was about whether the monarchy was subject to the same rules that governed every other employer in the country. As the case moved toward its first major hearing, James found himself at the center of a media storm that exceeded even Margaret's warnings about the attention his case would attract. Photographers camped outside his home, reporters called his neighbors and colleagues seeking information, and tabloid papers published speculative articles about his motivations and background. The pressure was intense, but James drew strength from the knowledge that he was fighting for something larger than his own grievances. Letters of support began arriving from royal household employees, both current and former, who thanked him for having the courage to challenge a system that had mistreated them as well. Many of these letters had to be sent anonymously because of the potential consequences for their authors, but their message was clear: James was not alone in his experience, and his fight was their fight as well. The stage was set for a legal battle that would test the limits of royal privilege and potentially reshape the relationship between the monarchy and the people who served it. James Morrison had made his decision to fight back, and there would be no turning back from the path he had chosen. The question now was whether the British legal system would prove strong enough to hold even the royal family accountable for their treatment of the people who dedicated their lives to serving them. The first major hearing in Morrison v. Royal Household was scheduled for a cold February morning at the Royal Courts of Justice in London. As James Morrison walked up the steps of the imposing Gothic Revival building, he was flanked by Margaret Whitfield and surrounded by a scrum of journalists and photographers who had been following every development in the case with unprecedented intensity. The case had captured public attention in a way that none of the participants had fully anticipated. What had started as an employment dispute involving one protection officer had evolved into a national conversation about power, privilege, and accountability within the British monarchy. Opinion polls showed the public was deeply divided, with roughly equal numbers supporting James's right to challenge his treatment and defending the royal family's traditional immunity from such legal proceedings. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The public gallery was packed with a mixture of royal supporters, workers' rights advocates, journalists, and curious members of the public who had managed to secure seats for what was already being called one of the most significant constitutional cases of the modern era. James took his seat at the plaintiff's table, trying to project confidence despite the butterflies in his stomach. Across the courtroom, Queen Camilla's legal team occupied the defense table, a formidable group of barristers led by Sir Charles Pemberton, one of the most respected constitutional lawyers in the country. Sir Charles had represented the royal family in numerous previous cases and was known for his skill in navigating the complex legal territory where constitutional law intersected with individual rights. The presiding judge was Justice Miranda Thornfield, a woman in her late 50s who had built her reputation on careful legal reasoning and an absolute commitment to the principle that no one, regardless of their position or status, should be above the law. Her presence on the case was seen as a positive development for James's team, as she was known for her independence and her willingness to make difficult decisions based on legal merit rather than political considerations. As the hearing began, Sir Charles rose to present the defense's motion to dismiss the case entirely. His argument was both elegantly crafted and fundamentally challenging to the very premise of James's lawsuit. "Your Honor," Sir Charles began, his voice carrying the authority of decades of experience in constitutional law, "this case represents an unprecedented and dangerous attack on the fundamental principles that have governed the British monarchy for centuries. The plaintiff seeks to subject Her Majesty Queen Camilla to the ordinary processes of employment law, as if she were no different from any other employer in the realm." He paused for effect before continuing. "But, Your Honor, the monarchy is not an ordinary employer, and members of the royal family are not ordinary individuals. They are constitutional officers whose actions must be understood within the context of their unique role in our system of government. To subject them to employment litigation would undermine their ability to carry out their constitutional duties and would set a precedent that could fundamentally destabilize the institution of the crown." Sir Charles went on to argue that the doctrine of royal immunity, while limited in scope, still provided protection for the personal interactions between royals and their household staff. He cited numerous historical precedents and constitutional authorities to support his contention that the courts had no jurisdiction over the internal workings of the royal household, particularly when it came to matters of personal conduct and staff management. When Margaret Whitfield rose to respond, she faced the challenging task of arguing that employment law protection should apply even to the most privileged and powerful individuals in British society. "Your Honor," Margaret began, "my learned friend would have this court believe that members of the royal family exist in a legal vacuum where normal standards of human decency and workplace conduct simply do not apply. This is both wrong in law and wrong in principle." Margaret's argument focused on the evolution of royal immunity over time and the principle that immunity should be narrowly construed to cover only those actions that were directly related to constitutional duties. She argued that Queen Camilla's treatment of James Morrison had nothing to do with her constitutional role and everything to do with personal conduct that would be unacceptable in any other workplace. "The plaintiff is not asking this court to interfere with the Queen's constitutional duties," Margaret continued. "He is asking for the same basic protections that are afforded to every other worker in this country. The right to be treated with basic human dignity, the right to a workplace free from harassment, and the right to legal recourse when those basic standards are violated." She pointed out that the royal household employed hundreds of people and operated like any other large organization when it came to hiring, firing, and managing staff. If members of the royal family were exempt from basic employment law protections, it would create a legal black hole where some of the most vulnerable workers in the country would have no protection against mistreatment and abuse. The hearing continued for 2 full days, with both sides presenting detailed legal arguments about the scope of royal immunity, the application of employment law to constitutional institutions, and the broader implications of allowing or preventing the case from proceeding. Expert witnesses testified about the historical development of royal privileges and immunities, while employment law specialists explained how the principles at stake in James's case affected workers throughout the British economy. One of the most compelling moments in the hearing came when Margaret called Professor Sarah Hartwell, a constitutional law expert from Oxford University, to testify about the evolution of royal immunity in modern democratic societies. The principle of royal immunity, Professor Hartwell explained, was never intended to create a zone of lawlessness around the monarch and the royal family. It was designed to protect the constitutional functions of the crown from interference by the courts. Personal conduct that has nothing to do with constitutional duties has never been, and should never be, protected by immunity. Professor Hartwell went on to cite examples from other constitutional monarchies, including Canada, Australia, and several European countries, where royal household employees enjoyed the same workplace protections as other workers without any apparent damage to the functioning of those monarchies. Sir Charles's response focused on the unique position of the British monarchy and argued that foreign precedents were not applicable to the UK's distinctive constitutional arrangements. He warned that allowing the case to proceed would open the floodgates to employment litigation that could consume the royal household's time and resources and make it impossible for the royal family to carry out their duties effectively. As the hearing concluded, Justice Thornfield announced that she would need several weeks to consider the complex legal issues that had been raised. She emphasized that her decision would be based entirely on legal principles and constitutional law, without regard to political considerations or public opinion about the monarchy. The waiting period that followed was agonizing for everyone involved in the case. James continued his administrative duties at Windsor Castle, working in an atmosphere of barely concealed hostility from colleagues who saw him as a traitor to the institution they all served. Anonymous threats began appearing in his mailbox, and his family faced harassment from royal supporters who viewed his case as an attack on the monarchy itself. At the same time, James also received an outpouring of support from unexpected quarters. Workers' rights organizations rallied to his cause, seeing his case as a crucial test of whether employment law protections would be enforced equally regardless of the power and status of the employer. Letters of support arrived from around the world, from people who saw his stand as representing fundamental principles of human dignity and equality under the law. The royal household, meanwhile, was clearly feeling the pressure from the unprecedented legal challenge. Palace sources leaked stories to friendly journalists suggesting that James was motivated by financial gain rather than principle, and that his case was being funded by Republican organizations seeking to damage the monarchy. These attacks were largely ineffective, as Margaret had been careful to document James's pure motivations and the case was being funded through normal legal aid channels rather than by any political organizations. More significantly, the stress of the ongoing legal battle was apparently taking its toll within the royal household itself. Reports emerged of increased tension among staff members, with some calling for reforms to employment practices while others insisted that any concessions would undermine royal authority. There were rumors that King Charles was personally concerned about the case and had ordered a review of household employment policies, though these reports were officially denied by palace spokespersons. 3 weeks after the hearing concluded, Justice Thornfield issued her ruling in a decision that would reverberate through the British legal and political system for years to come. In a carefully reasoned 40-page judgment, she ruled that James's case could proceed to trial, finding that royal immunity did not extend to personal conduct that was unrelated to constitutional duties. The principle of equality under the law is fundamental to our democratic society, Justice Thornfield wrote. While members of the royal family enjoy certain immunities in their constitutional roles, they are not above the law when it comes to their personal conduct as employers. To rule otherwise would create an unacceptable exception to basic employment protections that have been hard-won by workers throughout our society. The decision was a stunning victory for James and his legal team, but it also marked the beginning of an even more intense phase of the legal battle. The royal household immediately announced that they would appeal the decision, setting up a lengthy legal process that would likely end up before the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. More immediately, the ruling meant that the case would proceed to a full trial where James would have the opportunity to present evidence about his treatment and to call witnesses who could testify about the broader culture within the royal household. The prospect of Queen Camilla being cross-examined under oath about her treatment of James was unprecedented in modern British history and would undoubtedly generate enormous media attention. The royal household's response to the ruling was swift and aggressive. Palace sources briefed journalists that they remained confident that the case would ultimately be dismissed on appeal, and that the royal family would use every legal means available to protect themselves from what they characterized as vexatious litigation. At the same time, however, there were signs that the ongoing legal battle was forcing some soul-searching within the royal establishment. Reports emerged that senior household officials were conducting a comprehensive review of employment policies and procedures, apparently in response to concerns that other employees might follow James's example if their grievances were not addressed through internal channels. For James personally, Justice Thornfield's ruling represented both vindication and the beginning of an even more challenging phase of his fight. The legal victory proved that his case had merit and that the British legal system was prepared to hold even the royal family accountable for their treatment of employees. At the same time, he knew that the royal household would now use every resource at their disposal to discredit him and his case before it reached trial. The battle lines were clearly drawn for what promised to be one of the most significant legal confrontations in modern British history. On one side stood James Morrison, a single protection officer fighting for his dignity and for the principle that no one should be above basic standards of human decency. On the other side stood the full weight and power of the British monarchy, determined to protect their traditional privileges and immunities from what they saw as an existential challenge. The outcome of this battle would determine not just James's personal future, but also the future relationship between the monarchy and the thousands of people who worked to support it. The stakes could not have been higher, and both sides knew that there could be only one winner in the struggle that was about to unfold. The trial of Morrison versus Royal Household began on a crisp Monday morning in October 2025, almost exactly 1 year after the encounter in Windsor Castle that had started it all. The royal courts of justice had been transformed into what many observers called a fortress, with unprecedented security measures in place to manage the massive media attention and public interest that the case had generated. James Morrison sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing his best suit and trying to project the calm confidence that Margaret Whitfield had coached him to display. Over the past year, he had been transformed from an anonymous royal protection officer into a household name, a symbol of either courageous resistance to privilege or dangerous rebellion against constitutional order, depending on one's perspective. The months leading up to the trial had been a roller coaster of legal maneuvering, media scrutiny, and personal challenges that had tested James and his family in ways they had never imagined. The royal household's appeal of Justice Thornfield's ruling had been unsuccessful, with the Court of Appeal confirming that the case should proceed to trial. However, the legal battle had taken its toll on everyone involved. James had been suspended from his position with the Royal Protection Service shortly after the appeal was denied, officially pending the outcome of the trial but effectively ending his 15-year career in royal service. The financial strain of being without his primary income, combined with the legal costs that were mounting despite Margaret's generous payment arrangements, had forced the Morrison family to remortgage their home and consider selling their car. More challenging than the financial pressures were the personal costs of being at the center of a national controversy. James's children had faced harassment at school from classmates whose parents supported the royal family, while Sarah had been forced to take extended leave from her job as a nurse when patients began requesting different caregivers because of her association with the case. Despite these challenges, the family had also experienced an outpouring of support that had sustained them through the darkest moments. Letters of encouragement arrived daily from people around the world who saw James's fight as representing larger principles of justice and equality. A crowdfunding campaign organized by workers' rights groups had raised enough money to help with some of their expenses, and several prominent civil rights organizations had provided legal and moral support for the case. As the trial began, it became clear that this would be unlike any legal proceeding in modern British history. The plaintiff's table was occupied by James and his legal team, while the defense table was crowded with an unprecedented array of legal talent representing both Queen Camilla personally and the royal household as an institution. The public gallery was packed with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public who had won the lottery for the limited number of seats available to witness what many considered a historic moment. Justice Thornfield, who had presided over the preliminary hearings, would also oversee the trial. Her earlier ruling had established her commitment to treating this case like any other employment dispute, regardless of the extraordinary circumstances and the prominence of the defendants. Margaret Whitfield rose to deliver the opening statement for the plaintiff, and her words would set the tone for everything that followed. Your Honor, Margaret began, this case is fundamentally about a simple principle that should apply to every workplace in this country, the principle that employees have the right to be treated with basic human dignity, regardless of the power or status of their employer. Margaret outlined the facts of James's encounter with Queen Camilla, emphasizing the contrast between his 15 years of exemplary service and the cruel dismissiveness he had experienced that October morning. She painted a picture of a dedicated public servant who had asked for nothing more than the basic respect that any employee should be able to expect from their supervisor. The defendants would have you believe that this case threatens the very foundations of the monarchy, Margaret continued. But, what really threatens any institution is the belief that power exempts its holders from basic standards of human decency. Mr. Morrison is not asking for special treatment, he is asking for the same protection that the law provides to every other worker in this country. When Sir Charles Pemberton rose to deliver the defense opening statement, he faced the challenging task of defending Queen Camilla's conduct without appearing to endorse workplace harassment. Your Honor, Sir Charles began, this case represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the unique nature of royal service and the special responsibilities that come with protecting the constitutional monarchy. Mr. Morrison was not simply an employee, he was entrusted with the safety and security of the royal family, a responsibility that requires absolute discipline and unquestioning adherence to protocol. Sir Charles argued that James had misinterpreted a reasonable correction about appropriate boundaries as personal harassment, and that his subsequent behavior had demonstrated that he lacked the temperament and judgment necessary for royal protection duties. He suggested that the encounter had been blown out of proportion by someone seeking financial gain and public attention at the expense of the monarchy. The plaintiff asks this court to second-guess the judgment of Her Majesty Queen Camilla about the conduct and suitability of her own protection staff, Sir Charles continued. This is precisely the kind of interference in royal household management that our constitutional system has always avoided, and for good reason. The first witness called by the plaintiff was James Morrison himself. Margaret led him through his entire career history, establishing his exemplary record and his deep commitment to royal service. James's testimony about the encounter with Queen Camilla was delivered in a calm, factual manner that emphasized his professionalism and his shock at being treated with such casual cruelty. Under cross-examination by Sir Charles, James faced aggressive questioning designed to suggest that he had misunderstood the Queen's intentions and that his response had been inappropriate and insubordinate. However, James's calm demeanor and consistent account of events made it difficult for the defense to undermine his credibility. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Margaret called her second witness, former royal household employee Jennifer Walsh, who had worked as a senior housekeeper at Buckingham Palace for 12 years before resigning in 2023. Despite the significant legal and financial risks involved in testifying, Jennifer had agreed to share her own experiences of inappropriate treatment by senior royals. Jennifer's testimony painted a picture of a workplace culture where senior royals felt entitled to treat their employees as personal property rather than as human beings deserving of basic respect. She described being screamed at for 20 minutes by a senior royal over a minor scheduling issue, with language that was both personally insulting and completely disproportionate to any alleged problem. I was told that I was incompetent, worthless, and lucky to have any job at all, Jennifer testified. This was over a situation where a meeting had been moved by 5 minutes due to a scheduling conflict that was completely beyond my control. The verbal abuse continued until I was in tears, and, when I tried to explain the circumstances, I was told that my job was to solve problems, not to make excuses. Jennifer's testimony was corroborated by 2 other former employees who testified anonymously, using voice modulation technology to protect their identities due to concerns about retaliation. Their accounts described a pattern of behavior where senior royals exercised unlimited power over household staff without any accountability or oversight. Perhaps the most significant testimony came from Dr. Michael Harrison, a workplace psychology expert who had studied organizational culture within hierarchical institutions. Dr. Harrison explained how environments where powerful individuals faced no consequences for inappropriate behavior inevitably led to escalating patterns of abuse and mistreatment. What Mr. Morrison experienced, Dr. Harrison testified, is entirely consistent with what we see in any workplace where power is concentrated at the top and accountability is absent. The behavior tends to get worse over time, not better, because there are no natural checks on the exercise of power. The defense's case relied heavily on character witnesses who testified to Queen Camilla's generally positive relationships with long-serving staff members and her dedication to various charitable causes. Several current royal household employees testified that they had never experienced inappropriate treatment and that the Queen had always been professional and courteous in her interactions with them. However, these testimonies were undermined somewhat by Margaret's cross-examination, which revealed that many of these employees held senior positions where they were less vulnerable to the kind of casual mistreatment that lower-ranking staff might experience. Additionally, several of these witnesses admitted under questioning that they would be unlikely to report inappropriate behavior due to concerns about their job security and career prospects. The climax of the trial came when Queen Camilla herself took the witness stand. This was the first time in modern British history that a member of the royal family had been required to testify under oath in a civil case, and the moment was charged with historic significance. Queen Camilla's testimony was carefully prepared and delivered with the poise that came from decades of public appearances. She denied that her conversation with James Morrison had been inappropriate or unprofessional, characterizing it instead as a necessary correction of behavior that had exceeded appropriate boundaries. Officer Morrison's conduct that morning was presumptuous and inappropriate, Queen Camilla testified. As someone responsible for royal security, he should have understood that his role was to provide protection silently and professionally, not to insert himself into my morning routine with unnecessary acknowledgments and greetings. Under Margaret's cross-examination, however, Queen Camilla's account began to show inconsistencies and contradictions. Margaret pressed her on the specific language she had used and the tone of voice she had adopted, gradually revealing that the Queen's recollection of events differed significantly from the testimony of other witnesses who had corroborated James's version of the encounter. The most damaging moment came when Margaret asked Queen Camilla whether she believed that royal household employees deserved to be treated with basic human dignity and respect. "Of course I believe in treating our staff with respect," Queen Camilla replied. "But respect in this context means understanding one's role and position within the royal household hierarchy." Margaret's follow-up question exposed the fundamental problem with this answer. "Your Majesty, does that mean that respect is conditional on an employee's willingness to accept treatment that would be considered unacceptable in any other workplace?" Queen Camilla's hesitation before answering, and her eventual response that royal service involves special considerations that may not apply elsewhere, provided Margaret with exactly the admission she needed to demonstrate that the royal household operated under different rules that placed employees at the mercy of their royal employers. The closing arguments focused on the fundamental question that had driven the case from the beginning, whether members of the royal family should be subject to the same basic standards of workplace conduct that applied to every other employer in the country. Margaret's closing argument emphasized the courage it had taken for James Morrison to stand up for his dignity and the importance of ensuring that no employee, regardless of their workplace, should have to choose between their job and their basic human rights. This case is not about attacking the monarchy or undermining constitutional government, Margaret argued. It is about ensuring that the principles of human dignity and equality under the law apply to everyone, including those who serve our constitutional institutions. Sir Charles's closing argument warned of the dangerous precedent that would be set if employees were allowed to sue members of the royal family over workplace disputes, arguing that it would make it impossible for the monarchy to function effectively. Justice Thornfield deliberated for 6 weeks before issuing her judgment, and, when it came, it sent shockwaves through the British establishment and legal community. In a comprehensive ruling that addressed both the specific facts of James's case and the broader constitutional issues at stake, Justice Thornfield found in favor of the plaintiff on all major points. She ruled that Queen Camilla had indeed subjected James Morrison to workplace harassment and that the royal household's response had constituted constructive dismissal. No employment relationship, regardless of its context or the status of the employer, can be exempt from basic standards of human dignity and respect, Justice Thornfield wrote. The defendant's treatment of the plaintiff was unprofessional, inappropriate, and illegal under employment law. the judgment awarded James substantial damages for lost earnings, emotional distress, and legal costs, but, more importantly, it established legal precedents that would protect royal household employees for generations to come. The impact of the ruling extended far beyond James Morrison's individual case. Within weeks of the judgment, the royal household announced a comprehensive review of employment policies and the establishment of an independent ombudsman to handle employee grievances. Several other current and former employees came forward with their own complaints, leading to additional settlements and policy changes. James Morrison had achieved something that many observers had thought impossible. He had held one of the most powerful institutions in British society accountable for its treatment of employees. His courage in standing up for his dignity had not only vindicated his own experience but had also created protections that would benefit hundreds of other royal household workers. The personal cost had been enormous. James's career in royal protection was over, and his family had endured a year of unprecedented scrutiny and harassment. However, as he stood on the steps of the Royal Courts of Justice after the judgment was announced, surrounded by supporters and facing a battery of cameras and microphones, James Morrison knew that he had achieved something far more important than any individual career advancement. He had proved that in a democratic society, no one, not even members of the royal family, should be above the basic standards of human decency that every person deserves. The line that Queen Camilla had crossed that October morning had led to consequences that would reshape the monarchy's relationship with its employees forever, ensuring that future generations of royal household staff would never again have to choose between their dignity and their livelihood.